From The Australian, here's what's on the front. I'm Kristen Amiot. It's Monday, December 23. Embattled Victorian Liberal Party leader John Pesutto has backflipped on his decision to block ousted MP Moira Deeming from rejoining the party room. He's called a new vote for January 15 in a desperate attempt to save his leadership, as some of his closest allies urge him to step down. A Melbourne lawyer lied to her clients and forged their signatures, and she misused funds from a trust. Now, Elisa Berry has been struck off and called a stain on the legal profession in a withering takedown by a Victorian Supreme Court judge. That exclusive story is live right now at theaustralian.com.au. Illicit drugs are running rampant in Australia's immigration detention centres, and law enforcement agencies admit they're struggling to keep on top of the problem as hundreds of detainees await deportation. That's today's story. In September, a woman arrived at Sydney's Villawood Detention Centre with her 2 children to visit her husband. Located in Sydney's western suburbs, Villawood is the biggest immigration detention centre in the country. It holds almost 400 people, many of whom have been waiting for months or even years to be deported. It's not a prison, but some residents do have criminal convictions, so it's subject to tight security. The woman was searched by New South Wales police officers stationed at the detention centre. They found 250 grams of methamphetamine, as well as 3 cigarette lighters in her belongings. Her kids, who are aged 10 and 14, weren't found to be carrying any contraband substances. Their mother was charged with supplying illegal drugs, and within days, her husband was also arrested inside Villawood, where police seized 2 mobile phones. He later admitted he'd instructed his wife to bring the methamphetamine to the centre for him. And according to new reporting by The Australian, this isn't a one-off.
The Australian has confirmed that heroin, methamphetamine and fentanyl are flooding into Australia's immigration detention centres.
Damon Johnston is The Australian's Victorian editor.
These are hard drugs. These aren't cigarettes. And there is a major drug problem within the immigration detention centres around this country. These cases we're highlighting happened in Sydney, in WA and in Melbourne. There will be many more, according to my sources, that have happened in the last 3 months as well.
There are 6 complexes like Villawood Detention Centre dotted around the country, including in Melbourne and Perth. Detainees in those centres tend to have more freedoms than inmates held in prisons. That means they're allowed to own mobile phones and receive regular visitors. And the private security firms and police running the detention centres say that's part of the problem.
They're not considered jails. However, these freedoms obviously increase the chances for the criminals within the detainee system to source drugs and get them smuggled in. Australian Border Force have said that drugs are a problem. They haven't tried to hide from this. They say the high number of criminals within the detention centres is essentially encouraging the amount of drugs that are being smuggled into the centres.
Are detainees using the drugs themselves or distributing them, or both?
I think it would be fair to say both. Some of the information we're publishing shows that the drugs were used by the people that picked them up. But anywhere where drugs are a problem, users can become dealers as well, or distributors. So I would be surprised if that was not the case in these detention centres.
Officials from the Australian Border Force say the fact that many detainees have been refused visas or had their visas cancelled on character grounds has fostered a prison-like culture in detention centres, and that's putting the safety of staff and other detainees at risk.
Australian Border Force says that of the 1,000-odd people in detention, roughly 700 to 750 have criminal convictions. So this reflects the decision by various governments of both persuasions to essentially kick people out of Australia if they are residents or they're here on other non-permanent visas if they breach the law and they're deemed unsuitable. So necessarily they get parked in these detention centres and then they get ejected. That's how it's meant to work. But some of them, of course, have been there for many years, and they exercise their legal rights to frustrate and delay the process of extradition.
Last month, the search and seizure powers of border security staff working in immigration detention centres were expanded by the Australian Parliament. Within days of the legislation being passed, kitchen staff at the Melbourne Immigration Detention Centre found a package containing heroin and methamphetamine in the facility's dining room. But the new laws are limited in a situation like this. They allow guards to confiscate weapons and items that could be used to facilitate an escape, but they don't enable the facility's managers to implement blanket bans on technology like mobile phones.
I think a lot of Australians would be interested to know that detainees in detention centres can have mobile phones and presumably access to the internet. Many of them have serious criminal convictions and are being deported because they've been deemed to be unfit to live in Australia. So I think ultimately the government will have to tighten the regulations around mobile phones and probably ban them. The obvious answer to that would be that, as in standard state-run prisons, prison-supplied landlines are offered, and the detainees would then use those to communicate with lawyers and loved ones or visitors. So I don't think there's any suggestion that they would be completely cut off from the outside world, but it is curious that these people are in detention because they're deemed to be unfit to live in Australia, yet they are allowed access to mobile phones. And not surprisingly, some of them then use those phones to set up drug deals.
Coming up, why Labor's immigration headache just won't go away. Immigration is a sore subject for Labor. The party has typically taken a more humanitarian approach to unauthorised maritime arrivals in particular, often with disastrous results.
The outstretched hand of a woman grasping for life as frantic rescuers try to drag survivors from the boiling sea.
We need to get life jackets down to these people.
This was the refugee boat just seconds before it was swamped by huge waves.
By contrast, the coalition talks tough on refugee flows, a political tactic that's been incredibly effective at winning elections.
The most compassionate thing you can do is stop the boats.
And as another federal election approaches, the Labor Party's immigration headache isn't going away. Earlier this year, it was revealed hundreds of detainees with prior convictions for serious criminal offences like murder and rape were released from immigration detention after the High Court ruled they were being unconstitutionally held. In those cases, detainees couldn't or wouldn't return to their home countries. But the law said they couldn't be kept in detention either. A small minority of those detainees reoffended after being released into communities around the country and saw the government scrambling to contain the fallout and regain public trust.
Anthony Albanese has unveiled Labor's new front bench, dumping Claire O'Neill and Andrew Giles from the Home Affairs, Cybersecurity and Immigration portfolios and replacing them with Tony Burke.
Tony Burke has declined to comment on the latest revelations that drugs are rampant in Australia's immigration detention system. But the opposition, sensing a new opportunity to hammer Labor on immigration, says it's yet more evidence the government can't be trusted to run the country.
Dan Tehan, the Shadow Immigration Minister, has said that Australians will be furious to learn that while Labor is allowing detainees out of detention, it's allowing drugs into detention. And what he's getting at there is that after the High Court ruling last year, a couple of hundred detainees were released and they have gone on to reoffend. And we know that cost Andrew Giles, the then minister, his job, and the government's mishandling of that left the government in crisis. So Mr. Tehan is trying to link the crisis around drugs within the detention centres to the broader mishandling of immigration by the Albanese government.
Just lastly, Damon, how does this broad immigration debacle play for Labor in the run-up to next year's federal election?
Oh, look, I think it's generally been an area of weakness for Labor. We know what happened after Kevin Rudd was elected in 2007. The boats came. Thousands and thousands of people were in detention. Hundreds died. So Labor's track record on immigration is not strong. And this will play into simmering concerns in the community that they haven't learnt their lesson.
Damon Johnston is The Australian's Victorian editor. You can read this story, as well as all the nation's best news, sport and politics, right now at theaustralian.com.au.